Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the super duper Superman special from your boys at Not That Bad, a movie podcast. This is going to be so much fun. I am one of your hosts. My name is Connor, aka Clark Kent's undercover cop brother, Nark Kent, and I am here today with my illustrious co host. No, that is not Christopher Reeve. That is the incredible Gabe Tice. Gabe, how are you doing today, buddy?
Actually,
Should I call you Super Gabe today, actually?
I'm going to be going by my other persona for this episode. So let me just prepare myself, okay? I'm ready. Screw you, audio listeners. You don't get to you don't get the joke.
I didn't even think about the audio. Sorry, audio people. Gabe removed his glasses for those of you who can't see. That's Gabe also can't see coincidentally with his glasses off, but that's okay. We're here for a really interesting ride over these over this special on our Patreon. Of course, if you're here watching this at the time of release, you are a Patreon subscriber. If you're watching this later, head on over to our Patreon, patreon.com/notthatbad. Subscribe at any tier to watch our monthly specials, including this one and a whole catalog of old ones and all the new ones that will be coming afterwards. Man, so we're covering the movie that I think I was really excited to cover when we discussed the idea of this special. We're talking about Superman 3. This was released in '83, directed by a Richard, but not Richard Donner, Richard Lester.
I am indebted to Richard Lester. A Hard Day's Night is one of my favorite movies ever of
Oh,
all time. Of all time. The only thing more majestic than seeing Superman fly across the screen is seeing the Beatles running away from their rabid, screaming fans.
this movie has a 30% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 2.2 out of 5 on Letterboxd. The honeymoon stage of this movie didn't last very long, did it?
It didn't last. It didn't happen.
I
I
don't think
don't
it
know.
happened, yeah.
Yeah, this might be a case where somebody got left at the altar. So we're
Mm-hmm.
doing a Superman special because for some reason it's really difficult to make a good movie about this guy. For some reason, only Richard Donner has been able to crack the code in a way that made everybody happy. You have your Man of
Everybody
Steel
happy, yes.
fans, you have your Superman Returns fans, but if you're making a podcast about bad movies or movies that people don't like, there might not be a better character to talk about than Superman. And this is the first Superman movie that made people spin the earth around so that they could go back in time and not see this movie.
They certainly wish they could after this came out, yeah.
That's what's so interesting about these original Superman films. They're not just about Superman. This is a whole saga of battling egos and a revolving door of directors named Richard, from Richard
Yeah,
Donner to Richard Lester.
right.
And to talk about Superman 3 and understand it, you got to get into a little bit of production history. So, Richard Donner directs the first Superman. He's in the middle of directing the second Superman when he's canned by the producers, the
Yes.
Salkinds. And they
Mm-hmm.
hire Richard Lester, who they had worked with on the Three Musketeer movies, which are fabulous swashbucklers. But then they make Superman 3, and there are no guardrails. This
Right.
is Donner less, right?
in the in the most way it could possibly be.
And Richard Lester is given carte blanche, and this happens all the time. Every time a director has a hit for some reason, they are allowed to indulge in all of their personal foibles as artists. You go to Tim Burton from Batman to Batman Returns, right? Or Sam Raimi from Spider-Man 2 to Spider-Man 3. Superman 3 is the first in that proud tradition. So we just had to set the stage because I don't even know how to tackle this movie. But let's go ahead and talk about our history briefly with the Superman movies up until this point. I don't know about you. I'm the biggest fan of those first two Superman movies. Christopher Reeve is a huge part of that. And I have plenty of things to say about his performance here, but everything in those first two Superman movies, man, it's a kind of whimsy and charm that I'm just skeptical that we'll ever see in a superhero movie again.
So with these movies, this is a fun fact about my life. When I was like roughly 3 years old ish, I gave up. So my big thing in my family was when you give up your pacifier, you get something for it. It's like a big thing in our family. You get a little prize for giving up something that like you've had for the last few years. So I'm going on 3 years old, and it's time for me to give it up. And when I decided to give it up, I gave it up in exchange for Superman the movie. We went to the store. I wanted Superman the movie. We got it, and I watched it to death. And Superman 2, I grew up watching to death. I didn't grow up watching Superman 3 and 4. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But honestly, they weren't really sold that way. Superman 3 and 4 were not really for sale in stores when I was growing up, but the DVDs for Superman and Superman 2 were. So I grew up with those, and I loved them as a kid. I absolutely loved them. There was a long period of time where I gave up on the Superman character. I just didn't think. I think I don't know if it was just me being immature or whatever it was, but I gave up on the character because I felt like it was a lame character. Superman's so lame. He doesn't do anything cool. He's not cool like Batman or like the Punisher or like, all of these like more gritty characters. And so when I got into those and started reading like Chaos comics and started reading Max comics and all that stuff, I gave up on Superman, and I didn't return to it for a very long time. Um, Thinking of this special brought back so many feelings of nostalgia and so many good feelings that before I even rewatched this, I ordered a box set of the four movies immediately. I just went on eBay and I bought one.
That first Superman movie is a watershed moment for a lot of people. It has aged so well, like fine wine. It's always going to have that lasting appeal that it'll introduce you to the charm of the character at a young age, but I think it'll keep you coming back into adulthood to appreciate the mythic quality of Superman. You'll appreciate Superman not just as a guy in blue spandex and red underwear who saves people from the wacky antics of Lex Luthor. You understand him to be our generation's modern myth. That's not something I can say about Superman 3. This is a slapstick cartoon.
Yeah.
Some people might say it's more of a comic book movie.
People get so upset by this movie based on reviews that I've read. I mean, we're just coming off of talking about Godzilla at the time of recording this. And those are two movies that share a rating on Letterboxd 2.2. Share some of the original mixed opinions that turned into pure hatred over time. Because there are people, don't get me wrong, there are reviews that I read about this that acted like this completely ruined their childhood or ruined the image of these Superman movies for them. This has, it's interesting because so much time has passed and people said some of the same things about this movie that they did about Spider-Man 3. And
I was going to
now
call this
Spider-Man
the
3,
original Spider-Man 3, a movie
it kind of
we
is.
also now we have two movies that carry on this tradition of doing the evil superhero, but not really. But if you're wondering why are these two guys defending Superman 3, I think we should kick that off with something that is an obvious pro to me. It's easy, but it'll get the ball rolling, and I'm sure everybody can agree on this, that Christopher Reeve is as good as ever. I mean, we've talked a lot about this. The perfect translation versus the artist's interpretation. And somehow Christopher Reeve did both. I mean, it does feel like Superman flew right off the pages of a comic book, but he put finesse on it. And he was a major theater enthusiast. He was a true thespian. And he didn't look at Superman as just, I'm going to study the comics and do everything as accurately as possible. He put another layer onto that character and really tried to understand the best way to bring dimension to Superman. And the movie surrounding him we'll get into, but I really have no problem with what Christopher Reeve does, either as Superman or as evil Superman.
Not only do I think he's just as good as ever, I think this is the best he's been. And the reason that I say that is I think first of all, perfect casting for Superman. You're never going to get a better casting than him. Maybe way down the line in the future when somebody shows up who is cut from the same cloth, but we haven't gotten that in the years since these movies have came out. But in addition to being everything that he was in the other movies, he's refined his acting skills even more since the last film. He has his physique is at its peak, so he looks fantastic. And as he's gotten older, there's this edge to his look now. It's not just his physique. There's a little bit more to him. There's a little bit more of a look there. And on top of the acting skills that have gotten better, he's his presence has remained the same. This presence that made him so great for the role to begin with. It's everything you could possibly want from a Superman performance in my eyes and from a Superman casting in my eyes. We talked about it in our Warzone episode that is a comic accurate version of that character. But the difference, and again, I'm a Punisher Warzone fan, but the difference between those two is that Superman is a character that when you take him from the pages of a comic book, you have a little bit to play with, and it's exactly what Christopher Reeve did to make it work. Whereas on the other side of things, it's so accurate to the comic book that it could be at the detriment of the movie, which in that case it was for you. He adds to the movie with his casting in this.
So this movie's thought of more as Richard Pryor guest starring Superman.
Right.
And man, we'll get into that. Those people aren't wrong. They're not far off. But I do think that doesn't give enough credit to the material that Superman is given. I love the fact that he goes back to Smallville, and I actually like Annette O'Toole as Lana Lang at least as much as Margot Kidder's Lois Lane. I kind of prefer their chemistry and their dynamic. I think there is a real down to earth charm that comes from this Smallville subplot. I wish it was the meat of the film. I wish I could call it more than a subplot.
Well, we're gonna get into some of the nitty gritty shit, as we go on here about Superman as a character, about Clark Kent, the things that he goes through in this. But there is no lack of material that he's given to work with and things that he's doing in this movie. I know what people say about this being the Richard Pryor show. I don't actually agree with that. I think that there's an argument to be had that he's shown a lot more than people would have liked him to be. But I think you're right. I think it's almost a disservice to the film to say it's the Richard Pryor show featuring Superman, because I do think it's more than that.
So Richard Pryor, if we want to get into that right
Let's
away,
do it. Fuck it.
because
Yeah.
I don't have a comedian that I love more. I think he's everything that a stand-up comedian should be. I think every comedian in some way is chasing after his success and his persona. He revolutionized the game. Richard Pryor's movie acting, that side of his career, though, bit of a different story. If he was allowed to do his Richard Pryor thing in this movie, that would be different. If he got to bring that same wise ass man on the street energy, I mean, his interviews about this movie are better than anything he does in this movie.
Anyway, Superman 3 is out. You fall in with the bad guys, though, don't you?
Oh, yeah, I'm tough in this one, Jack.
Yeah.
That's right, I slaps the... Shut up! Sucker, hey, you heard me. Don't be trying to fly away. Come back here.
But Gus Gorman, he's a nothing character. I don't know what kind of performance they were trying to get out of him. I don't know what he thought he was doing. It's clumsy. It's awkward. I mean, everybody talks about the infamous skiing scene. I think that scene crystallizes everything that people don't like about this movie in one scene, and it's unforgivable. But there's a scene just as bad where he's pretending to be an army general to give Superman some kryptonite. But it can't just be as simple as, here you go, Superman. He has to perform his little General Patton soliloquy to this audience and talk about Punisher Warzone. What is it with these awful comic book movie villains feeling the need to restage the famous Patton monologue? We have two. I mean, that's not a lot, but that's more than enough. And this one is worse than the Jigsaw one because it literally has no place in this movie.
Well, first off, I do want to say I also think Richard Pryor is the greatest stand-up comedian of all time. I want to throw that out there. I think he's just the best to ever do it. Nobody can touch him. There have been many greats, but he is the greatest of them. When discussing his feelings on the movie, he did it for the money. But from my understanding, from all the things that I've read, he was legitimately a big Superman fan. He was like so excited when Superman 2 was about to come out, like beyond excited about it. He would apparently gush about it to people after the trailer came out about how excited he was for the movie. So they put him in this, and he was thinking what it would happen was he would get to finally start branching out to more serious roles with this, and he would be able to be a serious character. But when he saw that it was a comedic character, he didn't really want to do the movie until he saw what the bottom line was going to be. So he did. He showed up,
And the bottom line was
collected a paycheck.
$5 million in 1983
He was paid more.
money.
He was paid more than Christopher Reeve was.
Shameless,
which is crazy. Here's what I will say though. Everything that you said about Richard Pryor in this movie worked for me. Call me crazy. I thought he was just as charming as Richard Pryor could be. Maybe less charming as he could be, but it was the charm that I expected from him. That army scene that didn't work for you, I was laughing my ass off at. I just thought it was the most ridiculous thing I had ever seen. The ski scene, I have problems with. That was unnecessary. It was ridiculous. It was stupid. It didn't need to be there.
I have in my notes that we have improv sketches instead of action scenes.
It's somewhat true, and I think Richard Pryor in this movie could easily not work for somebody. What worked for me is that I was digging the character throughout the movie. I don't think it's a weak character on my side. I was liking what we were seeing from it. I liked that this character had like these motivations of like, okay, he's not a bad guy per se. He's a greedy guy, and we know that he's a flawed character, but deep down he's not a bad dude. And I love how he portrays this guy who's like gotten mixed up with these villains because of issues that he has with himself, his own greed, right? But he's still pulling for Superman. Like like there's that scene where he's talking about Superman saving the fixing the tornado in Colombia. And he's like, man, you should have seen it. Superman was coming down, and he flipped the tornado on its head, and he's talking about it all excited. And then, you know, you start to see how worried he gets when Superman's getting taken down by the supercomputer at the end of the movie. So I liked what we got from Richard Pryor in this. I liked his character. I enjoyed watching his character progress and like the motivations that he had, and I was laughing at a lot of the things that he did.
I can't go to jail. They have robbers and rapists who rape robbers.
I like that stuff, man. That stuff is so stupid. I have two sides to my humor, right? If you don't play a good enough balance either way, it won't work for me. But if you go too juvenile, it works. And if you go too, I guess, highbrow, it works.
Because I feel like he was defanged. I felt like he was muzzled. And that muzzle cost $5 million.
Well, I mean, you could see it that way, but the way that I see it is that this was a movie that really could be an introduction to Richard Pryor for a lot of people who wouldn't normally see his material. I mean, I could think of like a kid watching this movie and being like, wow, that guy's really funny. And like, he's making me laugh. And then, you know, unfortunately, they can't really check out anything else he's ever done. But this felt like, I hate to bring this to the conversation because it has a very negative connotation, but this felt like a PG-ification of Richard Pryor. And even though I think that is a disservice to his work and how good he is, I don't think it was a disservice to his character and his performance in this, because I really enjoyed that side of what we were given. It is him defanged in a way, but I thought he was able to make it work, and I enjoyed it. I like Richard Pryor in this movie, and I don't want to see it without him. Yeah, exactly.
Subjective.
Exactly.
And if you laughed at those jokes, all the power to you. But my problem is he literally steals the movie away from our titular character, a character who we're all coming to see. I mean, I know Richard Pryor was popular, and I'm sure he was a box office draw, but I don't think anybody watching this actually wanted to see more of him than Superman. I mean, this movie's backlash validates that theory, right? So Gus Gorman is just a character that has no place being the lead of this movie. And while he's not a despicable character, he's not somebody who I see on the screen and I just see red because of how much contempt I have. He is somebody who the movie fails to endear me to in any way. I guess the best way I can put it is, if this is my introduction to Richard Pryor, I really have no interest in Richard Pryor. It's only through the context of his work, his huge legacy, that I can find any way to even grab a hold of what he's trying to do in this movie.
Well, hey, I mean, you have, like you said, it's all subjective in that way. I didn't see that side of it. I saw this as a performance that really, um, I think it showed off what he could do in a family friendly setting very well.
I think
He
the
was,
toy did that better, though. Have you ever seen that? The toy?
yeah, I would agree. It did,
Mhm.
but that's the thing. I don't really have a problem with movies that do this, because Batman Returns is my favorite superhero movie. I've gone on record saying that, and that's a movie that very much focuses on the villains over the titular character. And some of it works, and some of it throughout the movie is a little too much. But I didn't see this as too egregious. I thought what we were being given was solid. Didn't all work. Don't get me wrong. You know, it's it's tough to get it all right when the
I was
script
just
isn't the tightest in the world. But
I
I
was just
enjoyed it.
desperate for that Richard Pryor edge. I was desperate
I
for
get
that
it.
charm and appeal. I mean, the only time I really light up with this performance, the only part where I'm like, yeah, that's Richard Pryor, is when he's standing in that unemployment line and he turns to the guy next to him and says, "Hey, brother, you got a match?"
I hate to say this, but there is another scene that I think captures Richard Pryor's nature really well, even though he doesn't have a line for it. Which is when they're talking about the loss of the 80 something thousand dollars, and they're during the scene they said he'll do anything not to draw attention to himself. That is, unless he's a moron. And then you hear this loud music and this car revving, and you see Richard Pryor confidently step out of
Yeah.
this Ferrari in front of his computer job building, which
I
is
have
such a perfect Richard Pryor moment for me. It's
I
like,
have in my notes that one out of every three joke is funny in this movie.
oh, I didn't
There,
see it that way. I have down in my notes, this movie is hilarious.
oh, okay.
Isn't that what a different side of the coin we have here?
Hey, one out of three. I mean, some people will tell you this movie has nothing funny about it. I mean, some people will say that this is
I think there are
uh,
people who think you're being
an
very generous
abomination.
by saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what do those people think of you? No.
Oh no, they think
Uh,
I'm out of my mind.
I think I don't even like the big gags. I don't like the showstopper gags. Like when the two electronic sign Walkmen, whatever you call
Yeah.
uh those stick figures, when they get into a punch up, it's like my eyes recognize something amusing happening, but it's not telling my brain. It's the only
No,
way I can put it.
I'm 100% with you on that gag. I actually hated it. I was
Okay.
like,
Interesting.
because here's the thing, they're building this comedic tone throughout the movie in a certain way, and that goes against, in my opinion, there's two scenes in my opinion that go fully against the way they're presenting comedy in this movie, and it's Richard Pryor's ski scene and that. Those are two things that just completely broke out of the "this is funny" moment.
But
It's
I would
not
say
funny to me.
the character who earned the most laughs from me was Ross Webster, played by the great Robert Vaughn. I
Robert
have it
Vaughn.
in my notes that there will be no Robert Vaughn slander on this program. I won't allow it. I'm a huge fan of that guy. This is not among his best work. He's known for playing really oily, silver tongued, nasty businessmen, right? I'm thinking
Right.
of Bullet. I haven't seen The Man from Uncle, but that's the side of his persona that I always really like to see pop up in movies and shows. This isn't exactly what he does here. I feel like he's almost playing a parody of himself, of his persona. But ironically, to quote our man Rob Zombie, he's more Lex Luthor than Lex Luthor,
Yeah.
right? I think he's a better representation of Lex Luthor than Gene Hackman was somehow in those first two Superman movies, which, let me say this right now, I love those first two movies. and I consider them perfect in a way. But if you ask me a problem I have, it's got to be Gene Hackman.
Really?
I guess that's something that people will disagree with me on.
Somewhat of a hot take you got there.
I thought his performance was a little feckless. I don't. I think Christopher Reeve deserved a more serious opponent in those movies, right? I feel like he was on an island, and Gene Hackman was. I mean, because Christopher Reeve really cared about what this performance would do for his career, because he was an unknown at the time. But Gene Hackman, he's Gene Hackman. He doesn't need Lex Luthor. He doesn't need any sort of esteem that these movies could give him, and it's something he didn't try to earn in his performance. That's all. But I actually do prefer, in some ways at least, Robert Vaughn's performance. I think he has more than a couple of good lines. You highlighted a moment just a second ago. Biggest laugh of the movie. I love when he asked no. So I love the fact that he's just playing a dick boss. Like, there's no
Right.
more nuance or villainy to this guy than there would be any corporate overlord in the real world, which I'm fine with.
Oh yeah, he's playing a personification of corporate greed.
Exactly.
That is all he is.
And I felt for Richard Pryor, man, in the scene when Ross Webster says, I ask you to kill Superman, and you can't do that one simple thing. Because our bosses just expect us to be able to do anything just because they asked. So I'm with you there, Richard Pryor. I get the way you feel, right? So that's another complaint people have about this movie. They think the villains are weak. I actually prefer the villain in this movie. I prefer Ross Webster to Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor.
Well, speaking on that, I would agree with you about him providing the laughs. I also think he's got this really good chemistry with Richard Pryor throughout the movie. I think their interactions are very funny. I wanted to highlight another one that they had, which is where the character of Ross says, "A wise man once said, I think it was Attila the Hun, it's not enough to succeed. Everyone else must fail." And then Richard Pryor just nods his head and goes, "Seems fair." And it just comes out of nowhere. This just like hilarious interaction between these two. They have that throughout a lot of the movie. I do completely disagree with our audience, because this is a major complaint about this movie, is that they feel like this is a very much a downgrade of a villain. And I don't agree with that at all. I think even the group of villains I even like as a whole.
He's a downgrade from Zod.
No, he's a downgrade from Zod.
Might be what people are talking about. And
I think he's about on
Zod.
par with Lex Luthor. And I like Gene Hackman a lot as Lex Luthor, actually. I think he's like, in my opinion, he is almost as much of a blueprint of what I want to see from that character as Christopher Reeve is as Superman. That's my opinion on
so
Gene
I
Hackman's
think we're definitely in different camps there.
We
I think the best Lex Luthor on screen is Michael Rosenbaum from Smallville.
Now that is also a very, very good performance.
I don't think any of the movie interpretations have gotten him quite right.
I think they've gotten worse.
I know. I hate to say this. I do think Kevin Spacey is the closest to what I want out of a Lex Luthor. But it can't be Kevin Spacey.
Oh God!
It can't be Kevin Spacey, because I don't want Superman to ever say, "Get away from that young boy, Lex Luthor." It's just beneath Lex, right?
It is. It's he's somehow more of a villain in real life, and it's awful. So I want to ask you this then. That complaint sort of encompasses who we consider to be like the four villains. There's three villains in the movie. It's
there's
Ross,
only two I care
sister.
about, though.
It's Ross and his sister, and then it's this assistant secretary woman, and then Richard Pryor. I don't consider Richard Pryor a villain. I don't even really consider the secretary that much of a villain.
Why not, though, man? Why not? I mean, Richard Pryor is responsible for all of the terrible things happening in this movie.
Kinda, yeah, but like, here's my thing about it, is that first off, I don't consider him or the girl a villain, and I think it's kind of fucked up that Superman saves Richard Pryor, and Richard Pryor's like, "What about the other three?" And he's like, "They'll go to jail." And it's like, well, okay, but that secretary had nothing to do with anything. I mean, she tried to help at the
Nothing
end.
to do with anything. Okay, she
Okay,
seduced
she did seduce
evil
Superman a little
Superman
bit.
and made him cause an oil crisis around
She
the globe.
did. She did kind of make Superman cause an oil crisis and did kind of bang Superman. Uh, which, by the way, I just want to go on record and saying I don't like that choice. I don't like that choice at all. Not because Superman can't be, have any edge to him. I just thought that was stupid, and I thought it was poorly executed. That whole Superman seduction thing, I think, was stupid. Now, Superman causing an oil spill was hilarious. I literally put in my notes, "Superman causes an oil spill, LOL." I thought that was very funny, but
But it would not have been funny to the audiences of 1983 who just lived through an
yeah,
energy crisis.
that's
Right?
very fair. I guess. I
I
guess
thought that
that's
was
fair.
like a weird, like to comment on that, but then to do it in such a glib manner, I think is something that would have been very off-putting to people. Like imagine if Superman Returns was about Superman flying into one of the World Trade Centers, right?
Oh God.
And then he goes back and he rebuilt it with his super speed, but audiences still had to sit through Superman partaking in 9/11.
Okay.
So
I want to get to evil Superman in a second because I think that's important, but I want to ask you first what you feel about those other two, arguably the two sidekicks next to our businessman, his sister and his secretary. What are your thoughts on them? Do you think that they're part of the weak complaint?
yeah, oh for sure. When
Okay.
people talk about weak villains, I can lump those in. While I disagree about Robert Vaughn, I mean they're just sidekicks. That's
Right.
like fucking Otis from the first movie, Ned Beatty. He was a weak villain, if you even want to call him a villain. But that's sort of defeating the point. I mean, we have Robert Vaughn and we have Richard Pryor. Excuse me. And we have Richard Pryor. Those are the only two that matter in this part of the discussion. Now, the sister does get turned into a cyborg in a moment that famously traumatized a lot of children.
Yeah, it
And
scared the shit out of a lot of kids.
I'm here for that. I'm here for that. But Superman doesn't get to fight her. What is with that?
That felt like a weird choice because I thought that was a pretty like grotesque sequence. I mean, for a kids movie, like this movie is not necessarily a kids movie, but it's kind of it's much of a kids movie as the first two Star Wars movies are. And
It's more of a kids movie than
yeah, I would say
than
more
either
of them.
those. Yeah.
Well, I'd say it's about as much of a kids movie as Return of the Jedi is, because the Ewoks and all that. Everybody's just gonna shit on that movie, including you. So I'm just gonna leave that alone.
Yeah, play the victim. Play the
Oh,
victim.
I will. I'll milk that card as much as I can with Return of the Jedi. Anyways, this came out the same year, by the way, which is interesting. But
Man, the year of the bad third movie.
oh my
Jesus.
God, we're gonna fight. I thought that sequence was really cool. I didn't know where they were going with it at first, and it did make me laugh a little bit when they like go close to the eyes and like the silver paints on her face, and I was like, oh my God, this is gonna be so stupid. And then they zoom out, and I'm like, oh no, this is actually kind of fucking hilarious. I like this. This is good. It's both funny. The scene itself was pretty grotesque.
She has Zod's finger pointing powers. You remember in
Yeah.
Superman 2, Zod can pick things up by pointing his finger at them.
Zod can do a lot.
You know. Yeah.
Still can Superman.
There's a reason why his name rhymes with God, okay?
Yeah.
I don't know what that guy can't do. And for some reason, that's one power that's carried over for this villain here. But Superman doesn't even take her out. Superman, who just had a really awesome fight with himself a few scenes prior, what does he do? She just goes down because of the computer malfunctioning, and that was a cop out. Which is how most of the that's how most of the action feels in this movie, aside from a few things.
I'll agree with that. I think it's so funny because this movie feels far from cheap, but it feels like some of the budget was really misguided. Like,
yes,
honestly,
yes,
this is a movie that really, when you think about the Superman films and how significant they are, they're for the most part, they could be classified as independent films. I mean, they're completely financed by What's the name of the
Sulkins?
the Sulkins? It's completely financed by them. They're the sole financiers
They're
of
the
these
Lex
movies.
Luthors
They are the
of the
Lex
Superman
Luthors,
franchise.
and so it doesn't feel like a cheap movie. I think the production value is pretty significant, actually, especially when you compare it to the next movie, which only had like a $17 million budget. It was like cut in like a third, I think, partway through production by Canon Films. Shout out to Canon Films. This movie was not a Canon movie, and you can tell.
No, but let me explain what I think is going on. I think we have a director who doesn't know how to work with a budget like this.
I will agree with
And
that.
some directors know how to put that money on the screen. Richard Donner was your guy for that. I think he is just as good as that as a Steven Spielberg or a George Lucas. Better than George, to be quite honest.
Oh wow.
Richard Donner doesn't need to be handheld through the edits of his own movies, right? In fact, he is so good that even when other directors like Richard Lester go in and try to fuck it up, right? The DNA of Richard Donner's vision can still save it. I think that's what Superman 2 is. I don't think every choice that Richard Lester made there was bad, but Superman 3 is what if Richard Lester were left to his own devices without Donner's vision to guide him. And we see the difference in quality of those two visions. By the way,
We certainly see the difference in opinion.
Yeah, have you seen the Donner cut of Superman 2?
Not yet. No, I actually didn't even know it was out. Like that's how long I've been out of the Superman game. I saw it came out in like 2006. I have not seen it.
It's worth your time. It's worth your time. But
I hope it would be. I mean, honestly, I'm a big fan of Superman 2 as it is, so I'm excited to see if it gets even better.
I like the theatrical cut of Superman 2 as it stands. And I started this program off by telling people how much I like Richard Lester. He's a guy who's going to be kind of haunted by these two Superman movies when he should be remembered for being the father of the music video. I mean, that's kind of what Hard Day's Night is. So he just has a really, really unbalanced legacy. But let me tell you what he does right. He does know how to make eye-popping sets. Like I love all of the sets in these movies. Even something like Ross Webster's office, it feels for some reason as grandiose as Lex Luthor's little underground chamber. I mean, Lex Luthor didn't have a ski slope right outside his window.
No, he did not. He also did not have a gigantic carpeted room with a fountain in the middle of it, in which the fountain was replaced by a gigantic map and shot water onto the carpet. He didn't have that either.
And he did not have a cool Atari Superman game designed specifically to shoot Superman.
There's so many things I want to talk about with that. The first thing that I want to do though is say that this movie does I want to jump back to Superman 2 and Richard Lester and Richard Donner in that comparison to
the Richards,
to the most recent Justice League, which we saw Zack Snyder start, and then Joss Whedon came in and made his changes, and we sort of see the difference in quality. I think between Superman 2 and Superman 3, that's definitely a difference of it's a difference of perception as opposed to quality, in my opinion. Whereas when you look at what happened with Superman 2, I think arguably there are more people nowadays, I think, that would consider themselves a fan of both sides of that movie as opposed to just one. Whereas on the other side of the coin, you have Justice League, which overwhelmingly was hated when it came out. But the Snyder Cut has like an incredibly high rating, which I just amended and I lowered personally. But a lot of people really, really love that movie as compared to Joss Whedon's version of it. So it's interesting to see that two sides of the coin there.
Be honest with me right now. What did you rate more highly? Zack Snyder's Justice League or Punisher Warzone?
Originally or now?
Now.
Punisher Warzone?
You have pissed off a group of people that I do not ever want to piss off. So
I just want to say this. will absolutely defend Zack Snyder's right to direct the movies that he wants, and I don't think he is an untalented director. My problems with that movie are completely separate from what he can do as a director. There are things about it that influenced my decision to lower my rating, which started at a 4.5, by the way. It was about the highest I could give it without saying it was perfect. And then I had to lower it because I had problems with it. But getting into this conversation, there's something I really want to dive into right away. We've been alluding to it throughout. Let's talk about Evil Superman. We have to talk about Evil Superman. Please talk about Evil Superman. So what happens in this movie, to let everybody know who possibly hasn't seen it, who didn't care to, who checked this out anyways, they have this scheme to kill Superman with kryptonite. But when analyzing the makeup of kryptonite, there is an unknown material that they don't know. So Richard Pryor, just having bought cigarettes, decides to put in tar. Well, it doesn't kill Superman, but what it does do is it corrupts Superman. If you want to call it that. Superman's colors are drained from his suit. He grows a little bit of a 5 o'clock shadow, and he just starts fucking with people. He's not necessarily doing villain shit, but let me take you through a couple of things that Superman does after he is corrupted. He fixes the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He blows out the torch at the opening ceremony of the Olympics. He has sex with a stranger and causes an oil spill.
Yeah. Okay. I wrote down in my notes, is this really the wackiest material we can get out of Evil Superman? That's sort of the problem.
Oh, God.
If I'm judging this movie as the farce that I think it's aspiring to be, at least whenever Christopher Reeve isn't on screen, it doesn't live up to those heights.
Really?
I don't think it does. I think there are much more interesting things that Evil Superman could be doing with his time than straightening the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Dude,
and
that's why I
pissing off
loved
the
it so
one
much.
tourist that's standing. No, not a tourist, some street vendor who's trying to sell Leaning Tower of Pisa statues.
Dude.
And this guy gets his livelihood ruined twice by evil and good Superman.
That's what I loved about it so much. Okay, I have to talk about this. So Superman fixes the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? And the street vendor selling statues outside of it gets super pissed off and breaks his current ones because now it does not represent the now straight Tower of Pisa.
Just the Tower of Pisa.
So he goes and makes a whole bunch more and comes back. And the moment he starts selling them again, Superman is no longer bad and fixes it and makes it the Leaning Tower of Pisa again. So now this man has had his life ruined by both evil Superman and regular Superman. I loved it so much. I loved the fact that Superman gets bad, and by the way, he also gets drunk in a bar and runs away from people.
Probably the most famous image from this movie is drunk Superman at the bar with his 5 o'clock shadow and Christopher Reeve's perfect hair. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Christopher Reeve in this movie gave a bunch of people a real bad boy fixation, right? Like, I wouldn't be surprised if this was the genesis for a lot of people's unfortunate attraction to douchebags.
It could be. To me, this is the way you do it. If you're gonna go with this kind of tone in a movie, you make him do the dumbest shit possible, and that, in my mind, that they accomplish that with flying colors. I love the fact that all he does when he's evil is just the basic of bad things. That Superman is such an uncorruptible. He's not out there snapping necks. He's not out there, killing people.
I love the
jumping
fact
through
that
buildings.
Even Christopher Reeve at his most corrupt won't do something that regular Henry Cavill would do as Superman. Just a very interesting commentary.
Isn't it?
No, I mean, look, it's Spider-Man 3 syndrome. They don't want us to turn on the character. So even when it's not their fault, I mean, he's being corrupted by wonky kryptonite.
Yeah.
They still don't want us to be subjected to the sight of a truly evil Superman. I mean, that would be upsetting to see somebody as noble and virtuous as Christopher Reeve doing something like thievery or, yeah, I mean, this is Superman. Imagine the catastrophes he could cause. Now, as an adult, that's what I want to see. I want to see a
Really?
Superman
Okay.
because I want to see this character have a true arc. I want to see him go to the lowest point and have to rise up from that. And that's something that they're not inclined to give us with this movie. I don't even understand why they're trying evil Superman if that's not something they can commit to. I mean, it's not like Spider-Man 3 where, yes, I mean, there's a lot of awkward comedy, but we are still supposed to be disturbed and scared for Peter. And if there is one scene in this movie that gives me that feeling, it's the very first sign of trouble when Superman doesn't want to go save the people on the bridge. Because it's very subtle. It's just Superman not wanting to do his responsibilities and go help people. He'd rather be with Lana Lang. Christopher Reeve can play it very like restrained. Like there's nothing ridiculous about it or comical. It's a subtle shift, but it's still upsetting. That's one scene, but it's not that much later when he drops the black curl in front of his forehead and starts going around and sabotaging and vandalizing, global landmarks. It's just, the question is, does Richard Lester have the right to do this? Now that he's the director, he's the only voice of authority on the artistic vision of these Superman movies. Does he have the right to take what was a true mythic character and turn him into this?
First off, I just got done choking on my drink, and could you imagine if I would have died in the midst of talking about Superman 3? I just want to take that.
I would make
moment.
sure that would be on your tombstone, buddy. I'm sure that's how you would want it.
It absolutely is. I think he absolutely has the right to do it, and I'm actually going to take it one step further and say that there wasn't just that one scene, which I loved, by the way. There were 3 scenes that solidified it for me, that actually made it a good decision. And here's why I'm going to say that. The first one was what you described. I thought that was perfectly executed. I thought it was great that he sort of plays it off at first, like, oh, I always get there on time. Let's sit down for a second. And then when he says, like, what bridge? And he's like, he doesn't even remember it, and he snaps back into being Superman. I thought that was a great moment that highlighted what was going on.
Christopher Reeve actually being given material.
Yes, and getting to show how much he's improved as an actor throughout this, because he's never been a bad actor. I just want to say that first off. But I think, in my opinion, he's even better in this.
I disagree that he's gotten better. I mean, he's always been a great actor. I just think I think the writers are figuring out more things to do with his performance.
That could be.
But getting back to what you were saying about evil Superman, what are these other scenes that you think are actually turned out well?
So there's 2 more. One of them is the scene where Superman's leaving the bar, which I was already, like, I had just finished laughing my ass off at the fact that he just, like, flips over this little bowl of almonds and just starts breaking glass bottles with them by flicking them at them. I thought it was hilarious. The other scene, though, is when why am I blanking on her name right now? Annette O'Toole's character. Why am I forgetting
Lana
it?
Lang?
Lana Lang. God. I keep wanting to say Lois Lane because the names are so similar, and I don't have enough brain power after a day of work.
What are you talking about? You can't tell the difference between Lois Lane and Lana Lang?
Anyways, when her and her
you
son
need to get
show
your
up,
head checked, buddy.
When her and her son show up to this to Superman coming out of the bar, they don't really have a choice. By the way, like, everybody's kind of just watching Superman get drunk in this bar, just in shock that he would do something like this. And
nobody's gonna trust that bum again.
Yeah, nobody's gonna trust that creep again. He starts walking out of the bar, and her son, who's, like, at this point, he idolizes Superman more than ever because at this point Superman has saved his life. So he's yelling to Superman, calling for him, and you see this like little bit of conflict in him, and it's almost like it's making him sicker. It's like he's starting to fight off whatever is happening to him when he starts hearing this kid pleading for Superman and just saying, no, he's just sick, he's gonna get better, please get better, Superman.
He's in a
He's
rut.
like and he's it's like he's actively trying to fight it at that point, which leads to the third scene that I think is perfect for this, which is when Superman quite literally fights himself. He is fighting off this corruption that has happened to him.
Everybody agrees this is that one good scene. Everybody can agree, even if they hate this movie, that this is the highlight of the film and something that just it's great Superman action. It's great stuff. I have a lot to say about this, and I think this is a case of accidental genius in a way, because I don't know if Richard Lester and company realized how much this scene means to the character, but as somebody who loves this version of Superman and has followed his journey from the first movie to this film, this scene meant a lot to me for a lot of reasons. And it doesn't play its hand very much, and that's something that I think is really cool about it. But to put it briefly, the theme of these Superman movies are similar to Spider-Man, about power and responsibility, but even more for Superman because he could be a god if he wanted to. And instead, he serves his powers for us. He saves us when he could be our Lord and our God. And we never, like, Christopher Reeve is too virtuous to ever give us the idea that he'll go all like Homelander on us and use his powers for evil. But we know that conflict is always in there. I mean, in Superman 2, he gives up his powers just to be with another woman. A very relatable, but an objectively selfish act. By the way, I'm realizing how much these Spider-Man movies parallel the Superman movies. Like in Spider-Man 2, what happens? Peter Parker loses his powers and has to get them back to fight the villain. In the third movie, he goes evil and has to fight the evil version of himself, basically. Very interesting. But in this scene, you see not just Clark Kent and Superman, but Clark Kent and Kal-El, the human side and the all-powerful side, battling it out for the soul of this man. And there's something very profound to me about it, even if this movie has not taken the themes very seriously up to this point. I'm not going to say that I was like emotionally moved or I was getting choked up, but I really felt for Clark Kent when he was getting tossed around. And whether it be Christopher Reeve's performance, whether it be the fact that this is the most thrilling action set piece up until this point of the movie, whatever's going on here, it hit me on a deeper chord than I think even the filmmakers intended. Because it is it's the triumph of the Superman values over the all-powerful greed that he's been fighting in these movies.
There's so many things that you can take away from just one fight scene. It's the fight against good against evil, not abandoning your values, not letting things get in the way and corrupt you. Like you said, this desire to be one of the one with the people you're around, and this desire to be something more powerful. In a movie where Superman is quite literally fighting against corporate greed, it's the perfect villain to introduce in that part of the movie in my mind. And even if none of those other scenes that I highlighted were in this, that fight alone is enough for me to say that this works, because yes, they give us a villain that's not quite as outlandish with his schemes, if you want to say that. I mean, he does build a supercomputer that shoots out kryptonite beams. But on the other side of that, you get this Superman's greatest villain in this movie, both literally and figuratively, is himself. And even though you have seeds planted that create this, I loved the fact that they played on all of these themes, whether they intended on it or not. They're all there during that fight scene. And just watching that version of Superman just fade away after Clark Kent wins, I loved that. And then not only does he fade away, but then he opens the shirt up. And the incredible score kicks in, the incredible theme song for Superman, just one of the best superhero themes ever kicks in as Superman is back and is gonna go save the day. It was awesome. Honestly one of my I want to say this, one of my favorite scenes from a superhero movie pre 2000.
I wouldn't
Right
mind
there.
saying, I mean, well, pre 2000, how many great superhero scenes did you have?
Well, I
You
mean,
had
two of
Superman
my
movies.
favorite superhero movies are pre 2000s.
Yeah, just two, right? The Superman and Batman,
I like,
right?
yeah, I like. No, well, Batman '89, Batman Returns are both big. I like Batman Forever. Um, I'll even
Yeah.
say, I'll just say all comic book movies. That's one of my favorite scenes.
Yeah,
I'll throw that in there.
I think you're totally on the money with it. And let's give the creative team some credit. I think there is a reason why he goes back to Smallville in this movie. He is returning to his roots.
Yes.
He is getting back in touch with himself. Even if they don't address this in the movie, we can tell as the audience that he's trying to reorient himself after the fallout from Superman 2. You know, he has just killed the rest of the Kryptonians, and he can't be with the woman of his dreams. So where does he go from here? I like the fact that even in the most subtle ways, he is getting back in touch with himself. And Lana Lang does represent that human side to him. She's known him more intimately just by virtue of, you know, having grown up with him. And he seems more relaxed and more composed around her. I think that's a big reason why I say I prefer their chemistry to him and Margot Kidder. Like, I don't love the whole idea of Lois Lane treats Clark Kent like garbage idea. And that's something that I think Christopher Reeve kind of popularized with these two interpretations.
Yeah.
Like the idea that Lois Lane won't even give Clark Kent the time of day. Even if she loves Superman and has great rapport with Superman, to watch her be dismissive to the hero of our movie, it doesn't lend itself well to me getting invested in that relationship. But Lana Lang actually cares more for Clark than Superman, and that raises the stakes for their connection. And I think that's why it might be possible for him to be with her versus him with Lois, because Lois was never going to be happy with just Clark Kent. She wanted to be with Superman. But Lana Lang, it's a different story. I don't want to say that Lois is shallow and she isn't, but I'll let you take away your own conclusions. So there you have it. There is genuine subtext to this movie that people across the board dismiss as a farce gone wrong, right? As just a mishap of a movie.
Which I think leads to an interesting conversation. I think we have to talk about this, in a way, substitution, Lana Lang for Lois Lane, because it's a huge complaint that people have with this movie. They don't like the fact that Margot Kidder is reduced to a cameo role. You could consider this a cameo. She's not really in this movie. She's in it for a few minutes before she goes on vacation and a few minutes after. And
by the way, I don't know how Superman fights crime in a cape, because I'm just having a lot of trouble with mine just sitting here.
I can see that. I can see it.
So I'm gonna have to go to Superman's tailor if I'm gonna keep doing this for these specials. But go on.
We'll find out. But this is a huge complaint that the audience has. A big reason why they don't like this movie. I've read this so consistently across many reviews as a huge point of contention against this movie. I'm not going to go as far as you did on this. I actually really do like Margot Kidder, and I like that relationship between Lois and Superman. I don't love it, but I understand it, and I appreciate it for what it is. And I think the chemistry between the two is very good. That being said, first off, I am a huge Annette O'Toole fan. It from 1990, she's in that as well, is one of just incredible pieces of work that I praise all the time. That It miniseries from 1990, but she brings that hometown girl feeling. You know what I mean? Like if you go back to your roots and you're trying to find yourself again, it's interesting because she's trying to find herself too. You know, she's trying to sort of get out of Smallville, and she never left the roots that were grown on her. So now she needs to spread her wings and fly in a way, which is going to Metropolis where Clark is. But Clark would have never found her if he didn't go try, you know, to get back to his roots, and he did. And I like all their scenes together. I like their chemistry together, and I like the relationship that we see built between the two as the film goes on. I have no complaints about it. The only thing I will say is that I do wish a few of the moments were played a little less for laughs. Um, I appreciate the comedic tone in this movie, and I'm not one of those people who's going to say that it went too far in that direction because I like it about it. But like the picnic scene's a big one for me. Like if we could have just spent a little bit more time there, and we could have gotten a little bit more of their interactions before she just sort of got distracted by her oil leaking. I thought that could have been fun, especially because I like the end of that scene where Superman saves her son. But yeah, I really enjoy the relationship, and I'm gonna agree with you in saying that I actually like it more than 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 Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve together.
I definitely think you needed to change things up because where do Clark and Lois go after Superman 2? He erased her memories. That's
Yep.
something that really puts a cap on things, right? And even in the Richard Donner cut, I don't know if you know this, but uh, she gets her memories erased there too, just
Yes.
differently,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know a way out from this. To me, at the moment, their relationship is there's a wall stopping them from advancing or evolving. Now, at the end of this movie, there is hints of a love triangle that could have stirred things back up. I don't
Right.
think so. There's a rumor perpetuated by Margot Kidder herself that she was being punished for speaking out against the firing of Richard Donner. That's why she's not in the movie, according to her. With the end of the movie, it's clear that there were still plans for the Lois Lane character. So I don't know. Either way, I do think it's for the benefit of the movie that Clark moves on and finds a different kind of relationship. Maybe she didn't have to be out of the movie completely. It is awkward the fact that she's going on a trip for the entire duration of the movie here. I mean, how would Lois feel about seeing Superman turn evil, right? When she adores him so much and believes in him so much. So she didn't have to exit the movie, but Lana is something that really adds to this movie. I think it is a good call on their part, right?
So that makes me have a question for you, if I can. Do you
No.
think? Okay, that's fair. No, do you think Lois Lane? do you, oh man, do you think Lois Lane being gone from the movie is a detriment? And if so, do you think the relationship between Clark and Lana uh, cancels it out enough that it doesn't affect your opinion on the movie?
I mean, I said it as well as I think I can that I don't think she had to exit the movie. Is it a detriment? I I do wish that there was somebody in Superman's life who could be there in those scenes where he's going evil to say, "Hey, what's going on with you? Snap out of it." I mean, Lana kind of provides that voice in and out, but she doesn't have the history with Superman. Even if, and I don't need more Jimmy Olsen in these movies, but even if you wanted him to have a scene with Superman where he's like, "Superman, what's going on with you?" So the best way I can sum up this movie is it does have a heart. It's just buried under a lot of other elements. It's buried under a lot of corporate mandates and
Comedy
shoehorned
relief,
elements. I mean, comedy. I don't want to say that this movie can't be funny. That's the
right?
artistic
No, right,
instinct of Richard Lester.
exactly.
But but it seems like this movie pivots to a joke when it could have had a very sincere moment. But hey, if that makes this a terrible movie, then guess what? Most MCU movies are terrible. Most of them fall on their face.
I mean, you know, and that's something I wanted to bring up when discussing the comedic tone of this movie. And let's just hammer that down a little bit more because that's a huge complaint about this, by the way. People hate that this is not taken seriously. People hate the direction that they took with it. My thought process is this on it. It's like you look at the MCU as a whole, right? And some of the directions that they've taken. Like Ant-Man, I get it, like, Paul Rudd, comedic character, like that makes sense, right? Like but Thor didn't start as a comedic character. He certainly went that way in Thor Ragnarok, and that's a beloved movie in the MCU.
Yeah, but then they doubled down on that with Thor: Love and Thunder, which
Yes, they did.
I have huge respect for Taika Waititi. Huge respect, profound respect and love and admiration for that man. But that's a sickening movie to me. I can't.
Oh, I
watch
didn't
that.
care to see it. I didn't care to see it.
I finally watched it after hearing nothing but terrible things, and every nasty thing said about that movie is absolutely true. And here's where the MCU is actually more egregious. Superman 3 does take Superman seriously as a character. Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little wacky for people's taste what they do with evil Superman, but to me, they still take the character and the values of Superman seriously. Not something that can be said for Thor and Thor: Love and Thunder. Not something that can be said about Ant-Man, which I don't care if he's Ant-Man, if it's Paul Rudd, I still want something akin to a human element, a real story for that character. I mean, we can go down the list. I'd argue that Spider-Man: Far From Home veered dangerously close to that for Spider-Man. I Iron Man 3 had a real struggle there. The difference is they're actually undermining the characters with the comedy. And that is something that's Superman 3, and something that I can't believe I'm going to say really does better than the MCU.
I'm gonna agree with you. I mean, it's part of the reason why I didn't get as invested as the movies went on, because I think, and very smartly, by the way, and I don't want people to think that I'm slagging on the movies for this. They're just not for me, really. But they rightly so saw this trend of the movies that played up the comedy a little bit more were I mean, more people were going to see them, and they were smart to double down on it in certain areas. But the problem that I started having was like, okay, a character just got like killed, or a character you think just got murdered, right? And now they're just like telling jokes about like Thor not knowing how to be a, not knowing how to be somebody on Earth, or it's like, I feel like not only does it undermine the characters, but it undermines some of the serious moments that they try to build up in the movie, and it makes them have less of an impact. Whereas, like, when you're not taking a movie very seriously, but you're taking a character seriously, that can create some awkward moments for people, for sure. And it can create some really wonky moments that are supposed to be serious, like I think this movie does have. But the difference is exactly what you said. You're taking the character seriously enough that it's not, in my opinion, it's not making a joke of Superman. It's not making Superman a ridiculous character. Now, evil Superman, a little over the top, but it's not the same guy. The whole point is that he's abandoning his principles in those scenes. And it makes sense that he's doing something different than what we get from Superman.
Yeah.
Whether you liked it or not, it has a purpose. It does not have a purpose on the other side at every time that it happens. And again, you have every right to love those Marvel movies. I have no problem with them. Some of them I think are fantastic. But I think it's a little insane to look at a movie like this and criticize it for something that it does better than some of the Marvel movies.
I want to talk about the interesting place that comic book movies were at this time, because we have a Superman movie with no Lex Luthor, no Zod, no Brainiac, no nothing. I mean, when you're talking about comic book accuracy, I mean, that's something that sets people, that's something that is really sticking. What am I trying to say here? When you look at this movie, I think it feels like a betrayal of comic book lore to people, right? Because our main characters, outside of Superman and those guys, it's people who have not been in a comic before or since. Gus Gorman, Ross Webster,
Right.
This generic evil computer that could be Brainiac but is definitively not.
Yes.
But no, it's really interesting to me that there were plans to include Supergirl, Brainiac, and some like C-list Superman characters. I think the Salkins themselves did plan on moving forward with the script that included all of these elements. And I'm not sure if it was Christopher Reeve or Richard Lester, but somebody just thought that was too much. That was going too far. Probably Richard Lester, because he has no allegiance to the comics anyways, and he wanted to do his own thing. But that's the weird thing to me is this movie is sort of making lateral moves. Instead of Brainiac, we have an unnamed, unspecified supercomputer. Instead of Lex Luthor, we have Ross Webster, and it's probably because Gene Hackman didn't want to come back. I don't know. And instead of making Supergirl now, instead of putting her in this movie, they will make their own Supergirl movie, which we will definitely be talking about in a discussion that's going to be even more wild than Superman 3. So, do you think people would go easier on this movie if it incorporated more comic book elements, if it incorporated more of those characters from the comics?
It's a really tough question to answer because on the surface, you want to say yes. But the reason that I kind of don't want to say yes is because if they kept the tone of this movie with those characters, I think they'd hate it more. But if they sort of held to what Superman 1 and 2 kind of were, I think people would think this could arguably have been the best Superman movie, which I think is what upsets people a lot about it. You know, having a character like Brainiac in there, bringing Supergirl into the mix. This could have been a really interesting thing, and it's an interesting case study to see how it turned out not being that. You have a large amount of people who really don't like it, and you have a small amount of people, growing but small, that really have a problem with it. Or that don't have a problem with it, rather, who are coming around to it. So I think if they would have kept the tone of the movie, if everything else were the same for the most part, with the tone and the feeling and how they treated the characters, but they had these beloved comic book characters in it, we might be looking at like a 1.5 on Letterboxd. People don't like when the characters they love are not treated with the respect they feel they deserve, which is a big problem people have with the new movies. You know, with Jesse Eisenberg being Lex Luthor is a big example. There's many examples of it. I mean, Batman Forever is the one we talked about on the show. People really don't like how they treated their beloved characters in that movie. So there's a yes and no side of that. If they would have abandoned the comedic tone that this movie had, I think it could have been one of the most, if not the most well-received Superman movie. On the other side of the coin, if they would have kept that, it would have been probably one of the most hated, maybe next to Batman and Robin, maybe just above it.
You make a good argument, because I was ready to say yes, if this movie had tried to actually incorporate characters from the comics, even if it was in name only, people would be more inclined to go easy on this movie, because I think there are a number of comic book movies where people go easy on them just because there was an attempt to be faithful to the comic books. Not going to name names for now, but this is a pretty recent trend to me, where it doesn't matter how well a character is brought into a story per se, as long as it's something from the comics, as long as people recognize something, then it's a different equation. It's a different algorithm. It's something that they process differently. But I think you do make a good argument, for sure. I mean, to be clear, their plans for
Thought I just. By the way, official Superman
actual
cape?
Superman cape,
Yeah,
and you didn't wear it.
Thought I'd
didn't
throw that
wear
on.
it.
I forgot I had it until right now. I looked down
Oh,
and just
boy.
happened to see. I was just cleaning my office the other day, and I moved it from where it was, and I didn't even remember that I had it. But here we go. Got the Superman cape on.
To be clear, the Salkin's plans for these characters was not, let's say, a comic book fan's dream. That's me being kind to it. So Supergirl and Brainiac were going to be after Krypton blew up, they were going to be on another planet where they were going, like Brainiac was going to raise Supergirl and develop a thing for her, when she came of age, he would be waiting. And I think at some point that really obnoxious Superman character, Mr. McSpinklex, Miss, you know who I'm talking about?
I know who you're talking about. Yes, he was going to be there. Yeah,
he was going to be there. Dudley Moore was in talks to play him. Not bad casting, but I don't know. I don't want these guys representing those characters. The Salkins, who knows where their heads were at? They had a huge hit on their hands, and they had no idea why it was a hit. Right? They are your ultimate producers. They have a hit and they don't know why. So they're throwing everything at the wall. And that's what this movie sort of feels like. They threw everything at the wall. They threw all the humor, all the special effects, all the big names. And at some point they were ready to throw all of the comic book lore in there too. Probably in hopes of just having something that would please everybody. But Richard Lester, say what you will, he did focus it, right? He took all of those mandates and he did focus it into something that it's his vision. I mean, I watched this movie. It's clearly an auteur's work. I mean, it's got his fingerprints all over it. It's probably not a compelling argument to people who hate this movie's sense of humor, but I would prefer this over the smorgasbord of shenanigans that the Salkins have planned.
Oh, by far. And by the way, I believe in that script also, Superman and Supergirl were going to have a thing until they found out that they were related, if I'm remembering correctly.
Hey, if Star Wars can do it, man, if Star Wars can do it, why not Superman?
I mean, hey, if you think Superman was missing incest, then that script might have been fine. But I'd much prefer this as well. It's so weird because I kind of compare the Salkins a little bit to the Akkads in a way in the Halloween franchise because even though the Halloween franchise brought it up in a different way, there's this desperation at some point, and for me, that desperation pays off. But for a lot of people, it doesn't. And that's when you get to movies like Halloween 4 and 5 in the Halloween franchise and Superman 3 in the Superman 3 and 4. I can't say that the last part of that works for me, but this movie, isolating it by itself, which I think, by the way, I didn't say this throughout, but I think this is a pretty isolated movie in a way. I think you could just watch Superman 3 and you'd kind of have all the information you need. You don't really have to watch the other two to understand what's happening in this one. But
I kind
please
of
do watch
there,
the other ones.
Because I feel a lot of my analysis and a lot of the choices I justify in this movie only work in the context of those first two movies. I mean, to
That could be
me,
fair.
in this movie alone, Superman would be a blank slate. Like, I don't know what motivates him. I don't know anything that's going on internally other than he does have an affection for Lana Lang and an extreme naivete when it comes to the criminal underbelly of the world, because he does drop Richard Pryor off at some construction site and flies away without checking to make sure that Richard Pryor's not going to get up to any more antics. That's just very optimistic on Superman's part. I know Richard Pryor technically saved his life or whatever.
Right. It also makes for a scene that I thought was very funny where Richard Pryor kind of rips his shirt open to reveal like a Superman shirt, and when he doesn't have one on, he's like, "Oh yeah, I think I'll, you know what? I think I'll walk there. I think I'll walk 9-10 miles. Yeah." And he does like, yeah, I think I'll walk there. It's very funny. I think it leads to a good moment. But you're right. I think Superman as a character is very like wholesome and naive in a lot of ways. I think that's sort of part of his appeal, especially early
the rap on him, right? That's what his critics have always said.
And I think it's fair. I mean, it's just whether or not you like it or not.
I guess so. I mean, naive. There's naive, and then there's stupid. He's optimistic,
right?
Perhaps to a fault, but that's something that makes him an endearing character. He could be a tyrant. he could use his powers for evil, but he sees the good in people and he thinks they're worth saving. And he challenges us, the audience, to do the same, right? Because we could, like Gus Gorman, even if we're an ordinary person, we could screw over people to get what we want. We all have that in us. We all have an evil Superman, but just like Clark Kent in this movie, I think we can all chokehold that bitch and fight it. By the way, can we just talk about how good of a fight that is? I just love all the times they knocked each other into cars.
Yep, I loved it. I did see a couple reviews that said it was awful, and I don't know how you could really think it was awful. Both story significance and the action that they hit. Which, by the way, Christopher Reeve had a lot of input in the action of this movie. That's where most of his input was. Yeah,
and I think probably the reason that the Superman character is left intact is because of his involvement. I think he was like an unofficial consultant because he's the only person who's been on the ground involved in these movies for all three, right? Richard Lester comes into this in a super awkward way and he does not understand the character. And the Salkins haven't understood him from day one. I mean, check out the plans they had for Superman before Richard Donner got involved. It would have been an embarrassment. It would have been a farce. Even more insulting than whatever they do in this movie. So thank God for Christopher Reeve. He's just one of those class A actors. I've never seen him give a bad performance. Unfortunately, he didn't get to star in a lot of great movies, but I've never seen him give anything less than 100%. And it's just really tragic what happened to him, right? And it's always going to be a bittersweet thing revisiting these Superman movies and knowing the fate that would befall Christopher Reeve. It's like Michael J. Fox, right? It's really hard to reconcile those two things. But to me, that makes Christopher Reeve more of an inspirational figure because he wasn't just Superman on screen. He was really brave in his personal life, and he made a lot of hard choices. And I just can't hate a movie with Christopher Reeve in it. I can laugh at it and I can feel sorry for him, which is what I do with Superman 4, but I can't even hate that movie the way I hate Batman and Robin or Catwoman, even though I think a lot of people put it in that regard, right?
it's a very fair point, Sir Gabe. It's a very fair point. I don't think I could do it either.
Yeah. So I think we have talked about Superman 3 more than most people could conceive of. Like, how much is there to say about this movie? Turns out there's a lot.
I was surprised myself. I knew this would be a fun conversation. I knew there'd be a lot of beats that we would hit, but I didn't expect this conversation to be as full as it was. There was so much that we had to talk about, and for good reason. And I think that that's a perfect point for us to leave on before we get into our final verdicts here. Because we got to deliver them at some point. Those are still part of our specials.
I guess we have to.
So I want to start with you here. Superman 3, coming off of two of your, I would say, would you agree, two of your favorite in the genre of
especially
superhero films?
The Richard Donner cut of Superman.
Especially Richard Donner cut. So where do you leave us on this one? What are your final opinions, and give us that final rating?
Even after talking all this time, I'm still having a very hard time summarizing my feelings. And I'm not sure if I like this movie or not, to be honest.
Oh.
I'm not sure. I feel like Superman himself. I'm in my own battle about this film. There is a Clark Kent side that really is affectionate towards it, that really admires and gets endeared to a lot of what they do with the Superman character. Nothing they do in this movie gets in the way of Christopher Reeve's performance. And while this movie's full of gags that don't work, some of them do. And ultimately, I feel it's a movie with its heart in the right place in terms of entertaining the audience, giving them an adventure, and taking this character to different places that we haven't seen yet. But there's an evil Superman in me that wants to smash this movie, to rage out, that wants to punish this movie for the the terrible improv it put me through, the miscasting of Richard Pryor, the unfortunate nature of how it was even made, knowing that Richard Donner would have made this movie and was fired, is something that definitely gives me some scorn for the final product, even though that's not its fault. It's just a movie that it's awkward because it was born of extremely awkward circumstances. And awkward is the definitive word I have for it. But if I'm binging the Superman movies, I'm not going to skip 3. I I consider this part of the Superman saga. It's not something I hide away, that I tuck away like Superman 4. And I would rather watch Superman 3 than a certain Zack Snyder directed Superman film. And y'all seem to think it's one of the worst. To me, it's it might be top 3 Superman movie for me, honestly. And hey, I mean, that means it's not that bad. Hey, it's a serious drop off in quality from the first 2, no doubt, but I acknowledge it and I accept it.
Fair point, Sir Gabe. Fair point.
Thank you, Sir Connor.
Yes, sir. Fair point, indubitably. No, so I want to start out my final verdict by reading some excerpts from a Letterboxd review that I found. This is a 1.5-star review from a user by the name of Kat. Kat says in parts of her review, "How dare anyone talk shit about Superman 4 after this? Superman without Lois Lane and Lex Luthor is lame. Richard Pryor is before my time, so I don't understand his appeal. He isn't funny at all. None of his jokes landed. The first half is like a bizarre Three Stooges skit. It's just mimes and pie to the face gags. Even evil Superman sucks. He's like, let's fix the Leaning Tower, blow out the Olympic torch, sex a bimbo, and then get drunk in a bar. It's so embarrassing, I can't believe Office Space got their plot from this story. Skip altogether and just watch 4 instead." I wanted to read this review. In parts, there were parts that I skipped, and thank me for doing that. Because I've never disagreed with a review more in my entire life. I did not love Superman 3, but I really liked Superman 3. I thought the comedy that didn't work for so many people landed for me. The appeal of Richard Pryor, while different than his normal appeal, was still there for me. His charm was still there. I enjoyed almost every moment the man was on screen. You get another entry in a perfectly cast group of movies when it comes to the character of Superman, and a great performance from Christopher Reeve. You get arguably a better chemistry between he and his love interest in this. Annette O'Toole carries her weight. The villains, in my opinion, are very fun. The comedic tone of this movie is so enjoyable. And while I understand the disappointment coming off of the first 2 films to this one as far as the switch up in tone, I'm one of those people who that new tone works for, who enjoys what they did with that new tone. And so it's for that reason and so many more that Superman 3, in my humble opinion, is actually good. I really like Superman 3. It is one I'm going to revisit often, along with the first 2 films, and is absolutely a top 3 Superman film for me, including films that just have Superman in it. And I'm happy to say that.
Very positive episode. Good vibes.
Good vibes. Around.
It's good not vibes a Punisher Warzone or Godzilla situation. I think that's a good thing. Superman is a uniting figure. I think he's brought peace, I think he's shown us the way.
Are you saying he's succeeded in his quest for peace? Are you saying there's a success in a quest for peace here, Gabe? I've never seen you
gonna-
be so disappointed in someone
gonna-
before. He's pouring another drink.
Pouring
Oh, no.
another drink, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, man.
Forgive my co-host.
I'm just a simple man.
And remember, this is one of a series of specials that we'll be doing about
Wow.
Superman films. And yet, the next film we will be covering does not feature Superman himself at all, in any capacity, any way, shape, or form. Instead, we are going to be following his cousin, and that's all they are, cousins.
As it should be, by the way.
Thankfully.
Thankfully.
So join us next time as we tackle another of the Salkin's unfortunate attempts to adapt the characters of the DC comics without the guidance of Richard Donner. The results are always interesting and endlessly fascinating and are perfect if you are looking to make a podcast about really despised movies. So thank you to
Yeah.
the Salkins.
Thank you to the Salkins, at the very least, for giving us a villain trying to kill Superman via Nintendo Entertainment System. Thank you very much for that.
By the way, that game was so much better than any of the Nintendo Superman games.
That's
Like,
a
just
whole
sell
different
that game.
conversation, but you're
Just sell that
absolutely right.
game.
Any Superman game has not been as good as what that could be if they ever made that into a real game. If there's a fan version of like a real version of that game, please find a way to get that to me. But yes, the results were interesting. I think if you've never seen this movie, you should check it out. I don't really know if you should watch the two movies first. If you haven't seen them, if you haven't seen the first two films, please watch them. They're incredible. But if you've never seen any of the Superman films, I would still probably recommend going back and watching the first two before this. Even if you don't dig them, give this a try. See if the different tone works for you. And let us know what you think about Superman 3 in the messages on our Patreon or social media. By the way, all links available at notthatbadpod.com or in the comment section when this makes it to YouTube. I would love to hear everybody's thoughts on Superman 3.
Yeah, and if you're a big fan of those first two movies and you don't care for the direction they went here, give this another watch and see if you pick up on any of the deeper themes or meaning that I found this time around, because I was surprised at how much I had to say about Superman 3. It's a movie I was not inclined to like. I didn't even watch it as a kid. I didn't acknowledge it as a child, and yet as a fully grown man who
It's
votes
a weird
and
thing,
pays
right?
rent, that's when I have found my appreciation for Richard Lester's Superman 3. So it's funny how life turns out.
Yeah.
But yeah, give this one a chance. And I honestly don't know where our next discussion is going to go. I
No
am
idea.
very curious if it turns out anywhere close to this, because that's either a movie we're going to be like 100% in agreement on, or we're going to go to war again. We'll see. We'll see.
I'm excited.
Tune in, folks, because it's going to be a wild episode. But for right now, I'm Gabe.
I'm Connor.
And this is Not That Bad, flying back to Krypton. The demolished planet. Okay, bye, everybody.